Greetings, my name is Mark Dadds from the University of Sydney on Gadigal land in Sydney, Australia. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today, where I'm going to talk about discipline and in particular time out from the perspective of child mental health, attachment and trauma. Discipline is one of the most important contexts for child development. On the negative side, it's associated with coercive interchanges, external control, and at worst, physical punishment, rejection, shame, and abuse. We know that most child abuse begins as kind of discipline type interchanges. On the other hand, though, parental discipline is potentially a wonderful context for children developing skills in self-regulation, moral and empathic development, attachments, and generally a cooperative pro-social orientation to working with other people. So I believe that discipline should be one of the key focuses, or foci, I should say, for research into child development and parenting. Now, time out is a very interesting example of parental discipline strategy. It was originally developed in the 1960s as an alternative to corporal punishment. Based on social learning theory, it's now become the second most common discipline strategy used by parents in countries that collect such data. It's also a core part of effective evidence-based parenting interventions for children with conduct disorder, emotion dysregulation, aggression, ADHD, and so on. And meta-analyses show that programs that include the use of time out have bigger effect sizes than those that don't. It is not a technique that's used on its own, but it was developed to be integrated into broader parenting such that time out was a contrast to a loving, positive environment so that, parents were encouraged and empowered to use positive, engaging strategies, and then time out as a contrast when the child was dysregulated. It's been subject now to over 60 years of research, but part of that research has told us that it's very much still understood and implemented incorrectly. As I said, the evidence-based programs that empower parents to improve child mental health and reduce behaviour problems typically use time out as one of its essential ingredients. But that's the positive side of the story. We also know that there's a lot of people very concerned about time out as a potential harm for children. And one of the big spurs for this movement came from Time magazine publishing an article in the 2000s, I should say, claiming that time out hurt children. And it was based on some neurodevelopmental research where they argued that isolation and rejection was the same as physical pain. Now, Dan Siegel, I believe, retracted this claim and said that what he meant was when time out was not implemented correctly. But it was too late, the cat was out of the bag, and all over the world, especially online now, there's an anti-time out movement where people claim that time out is harmful for children. So it's very important for us to get on top of this and understand as best we can what is the right thing for parents and for children. This became particularly acute for me in the last few years at the clinic I co-direct in Sydney, where we see children with severe behaviour problems. We received a couple of referrals and exemplified by the case of Song. He was a 7-year-old adopted male from Korea that had come out to Australia. He had a history of very early trauma and neglect, and at the age of 7 was showing severe aggression, tantrums, non-compliance, multiple fears, and some very, very distressing self-harm behaviours. Song and his parents had already been through a long history of trauma-informed attachment-based therapies which had had no effect. The parents were desperate. Song was hurting himself very badly, and they had been told by the adoption agencies and so on that they must not use time out with Song because it would be traumatizing for him. This is an example of how the time out movement has embedded itself in various clinical settings now, and parents are receiving this very strict advice not to use time out. So it was a very poignant moment for me, and I'll come back to that case later in this presentation. My aims for today are to talk about thus, what is the correct way the timeout should be done? What is the evidence for its effects when it is done correctly? And how can we think about discipline strategies and timeout in particular in a way that's relevant for the 21st century? As I said, timeout was originally developed just purely on operant theory. And these days, we know a lot more than just operant theory. It's time for us to update our thinking about time out so we can take it forward in the best possible way. So the history of time out, it was developed as a brief period, only 1 to 3 minutes, where access to reinforcers are denied for the child. So in other words, if the child is demanding attention, then they're put into timeout. The access to that attention is denied for a short period of time. It is designed to be only applied to operant behaviour. So we would not use timeout with elicited behaviour, things like fear and sadness and so on. Importantly, timeout was designed to have a contingent ending. That is, that it wasn't just a set period of time. It was contingent that it would end once the child had regulated and so on. So the child is learning to be able to regulate their emotions in order to have timeout end. One of the key drivers of timeout, of course, was to stop abuse and so on of children. And so timeout was designed to be implemented in an emotionally calm way with absence of shame, abuse, rejection, and so on. As I said earlier, it was never intended to be just implemented on its own. It was designed to be implemented in the context of a big increase in attention, positive, love, engagement to positive behaviour, and then the use of timeout for problem behaviour. And procedurally, we have a number of different variations on timeout. It can go all the way from just simply withdrawing one's attention when a child is whinging and whining, for example, all the way to a quiet time on a chair, through to time out in a separate, safe, boring and neutral environment. We do know, though, that time out is implemented in very, very diverse ways, and people have a very big misunderstanding of how it should be done. So recently we developed a measure of evidence-based timeout so that researchers and clinicians and so on can actually measure the implementation of timeout. So if you're interested, grab a hold of this checklist. The checklist is very simple, 9 items, and includes things like using timeout inappropriately. For example, if the child makes a mistake, using it due to fear, giving the child multiple warnings before using timeout, using it in an emotionally rejecting way, and so on. So we can actually formulate a score based on the correct implementation of timeout and use the measure in order to inform and train people in how it should be done. Now, if you look at the data, this is recent data we collected on Australia about how people are using it. And you can see in the right-hand column, it's got the percentages of people using it correctly, and some of them are very low. So people using it emotionally, not backing it up, not using contingent release, etc. Some of those are quite low, and so there is a general misunderstanding in the general community, which is what this sample was, about how timeout is best used with children. Now, if you're interested in this and you'd like to think about how we should use timeout and how it can be updated for the 21st century, I would refer you to this article that Lucy Tully and I wrote for the American Psychologist a couple of years ago, where we asked, what is it to discipline a child? What should it be from the perspective of the child's best mental health, attachment and trauma? And then we analysed timeout in terms of those principles in order to get a better understanding of how we can use timeout to best encourage the positive development of children in the future. In that paper, we reviewed some of the evidence. So I'd like to just go through that with you just briefly before we do the theory of this. There has actually been 60 years of research into the use of timeout as part of parenting programs, and the evidence is fairly overwhelming for the following. Implemented correctly, it reduces child conduct problems, dysregulated behaviour, aggression, etc. It increases pro-social behaviour in children. And of course, by empowering parents to be able to implement that, we can have seen consistent improvements in parental mental health, reductions in parental aggression and abuse towards children. In terms of more generally programs that use timeout, it might surprise you to know that not only do they do the above, reduce child problems and improve parent mental health and so on, but the evidence is that these programs also improve parent-child attachment status. There's also a number of studies that have now been done with children that are showing dysregulated behaviour in the context of trauma and adversity, and programs that use timeout with these children have been shown not only to reduce the dysregulated behaviour but to improve trauma symptoms in those children. Now, I followed every lead I could possibly get to find some evidence that timeout does harm to children. And I found two studies which were not evidence of harm, but they said that children said they, didn't like being put into timeout. Which was pretty expected, of course. I haven't been able to find one single study that's showed any evidence of harm using timeout compared to 60 years of evidence for the positive of timeout. However, as I said, there is lots of evidence of poor implementation. So as practitioners, as researchers, as policymakers, we need to get on board with the evidence and say timeout done correctly is a positive parent-child strategy. But it's not always done that way. We need to get it right. We need to work out what timeout is, what it should be, and so on. Now, my solutions to this is to not just dismiss the concerns of people that are worried about timeout because there's no evidence in the literature, but to really try and listen to what they're concerned about, reanalyze timeout from a greater theoretical perspective. And then once we know what positive timeout is, engage in rampant literacy efforts to educate policymakers, public, etc. about these things. So how might we update timeout for the 21st century? I haven't got enough time to go through all of this in the talk today, so I'm going to give you one example. But if you're interested in this, please go to the article by Lucy Tully and myself on this, because what we do is we pick 4 positive critical models of child mental health: social learning theory, attachment theory, emotion regulation, and family ecological systems. And what we do is we analyze discipline from each of these perspectives and then say what good positive discipline should be according to each of those models, and then we apply it to timeout. Now, what I'd like to do here is give you an example of that. As I said before, timeout was designed in terms of social learning theory. You know, the child does something wrong, we use timeout, that reduces the behaviour. But let's think about attachment theory. A lot of the people that don't like timeout claim that timeout is a rupture to the attachment process. What is attachment? Well, let's think about secure attachment. The essence of secure attachment is that the child has bonded in a positive way with the parents, caregivers, in a way that they are able to seek nurturance, reassurance, security, and then because that is consistent and predictable and reliable, the child is able to separate, engage in their own exploratory behaviour, and then reunite with the parent in a positive way. And of course, we expect this to happen on a daily basis. Now let's think about that in terms of discipline. Traumatic discipline is going to be that in which the discipline creates a separation that is not compatible with positive attachments and reunion. So in other words, it's going to have rejection, isolation, abuse, and so on in it. Isn't it interesting to think that that's kind of the positive idea of secure attachment is highly consistent with the implementation of timeout? In other words, a parent being able to say, I love you, I respect you and all that, that behaviour wasn't okay, into timeout for a short period till you're calm, and then we reunite, time in, everything is good. So thought of in terms of attachment theory, we can see that we can update timeout in a way that's a positive perturbation for attachment processes in a child. So rather than saying we can't use timeout with a child who's got attachment insecurity or whatever because it'll produce more attachment security, we can actually say timeout used very carefully in a loving, predictable, child-empowered way will actually be a reparation for attachment problems in a way that promotes secure attachment. And the way we think about it at our clinic is that time in is very much based on lots of attachment-rich rewards, and that time out or any other discipline strategy is based on attachment-neutral or solid discipline strategy that does not break the attachment bonds, but is compatible with secure attachment in that you can separate and reunite. But what about children that have been traumatized? It's very common said, as I said with the case of Song, that a lot of policymakers and practitioners now are saying mustn't use it with these children. What is trauma? Well, trauma is an overwhelming negative experience beyond the person's capacity to cope. We know that re-traumatization is common, and in children, the most common re-traumatization is with ongoing abuse and neglect and so on. And so the treatment for all trauma is, first of all, make sure the person is safe and that the trauma is not continuing. Secondly, help the person to re-expose themselves to trauma cues in a way that allows them to become empowered and reprocess that stuff and say, this is not trauma, it can't hurt me anymore, as well as fostering the broader social and emotional development of the child. A child that's been abused in terms of, parent-child interactions, discipline, and so on, they often get to the point where being given instructions, verbally corrected, given consequences, being alone and so on, become potent trauma stimuli. And so I think wrongly, people are saying you mustn't use discipline with these children. That is not the way to go. I believe the way to go is to say children that have been abused and neglected in context of discipline need to learn that discipline can be enacted in a safe, loving, and effective way. And as we've seen with the attachment theory, time out, implemented correctly, can be thought of as trauma-informed, sensitive way to achieve these goals. Okay, I'm going to jump over a little bit now to show you some recent evidence that we've collected looking at timeout implemented in this way. That is done with these evidence-based correct strategies for implementing timeout, and done thinking about it as a perturbation not only for social learning, for reducing behaviour problems, but for encouraging attachment and helping traumatised children. These are data we just published in JAMA, and it's from a large group of children with conduct problems and often associated ASD, anxiety, ADHD, and so on, treated with a parenting program that included time out. And the top scores here are, these are all SDQ total scores, and the yellow bars at the top are children that have suffered high adversity and high maltreatment as earlier in their lives as children. And this is pre-treatment and this is post-treatment. And what you can see is the children with high adversity and with high maltreatment start higher on the SDQ. They've got more behavior problems and so on. But when they go through the program that includes timeout, they improve just as much, if not slightly more, than the children with low adversity. These are quite strong data indicating that programs including timeout are appropriate for children that have been traumatized early in life. We also asked the children to draw pictures of their families, and we coded these according to quite psychodynamic criteria of happiness and psychopathology in the children. And we found that after the children have been through the program with using timeout in this way, that their pictures improved, indicative of greater psychosocial health, greater positive feelings towards their families. We recently asked 468 parents of 2 to 8-year-olds whether they used timeout, how they implemented it, and we scored them according to their correct use of timeout. And the data here is on trauma symptoms at the top and insecure attachment. And this is low timeout use, medium timeout use, and high timeout use. And you can see that for the children with high adversity at the top, timeout use is associated with lower levels of trauma symptoms and lower levels of insecure attachment. We also asked them how often they use timeout. And you can see there that in Australian parents anyway, you've got about 60% are using it rarely, sometimes, frequently, and so on. About 17% are still saying they never used it. and about 4% are saying they always use it. So I'm assuming that means always with regard to when the child misbehaves. But a very even distribution of use in Australia. But the vast majority of parents now are using this technique. Again, I've showed you this, but just to remind you that the extent to which they do this correctly is not as high as we would hope. Now, here's some interesting data. In 2023, we are living for the first time with generations of children that grew up with time out. And I don't know of anyone before that's ever asked them what they think about it. So we got hundreds and hundreds of young people in Australia and asked them if they'd experienced time out as kids and what they thought about it. And this one, we asked them to rate what was the appropriate discipline their parents used. And this is on a 0 to 5 point scale. And you can see that the highest rating one is taking away a privilege, followed by time out. Then we drop down for yelling, shaming, and smacking. But clearly the young people are endorsing time out as being one of the more appropriate parenting strategies they experienced. We looked at their reports of their current, in other words, when they're adults, insecure attachment, emotion regulation, and mental health problems, and we predicted those using regression from childhood adversity, how their parents implemented time out, and an interaction of those two terms. Now, you can see here that for insecure attachment, it was independent of their parents' use of time out. For emotion regulation, adversity was predictive. The more adversity the child had experienced, the more they were dysregulated. But the time out effect was in the opposite direction, that the more their parents used appropriate time out, the fewer problems they had with emotion dysregulation. And this is very clumsy of me, but behind my head, we have mental health problems predicted there. And I can tell you again that the more child adversity, the more mental health problems. But the more the parents implemented time out correctly with them when they were young, the fewer mental health problems they reported now in early adulthood. So I'm going to sum up now. What should discipline never be? Well, it should never be used for child mistakes, fear and emotions. It should never be humiliating, isolating. It should never be non-contingent. In other words, just punishing the child for, being a child. It should never be rejecting and having attachment threats based on fear or unsafe. What should time out be? Well, for the 21st century, we still want it to be an operant, in other words, a punisher for behaving inappropriately, but we also want it to be a democratic, family-owned, child-empowered technique that is used only as a small part of positive parenting. And theoretically, we want time out to be 1, a loss of reward, sure. 2, an emotion regulation strategy where the child knows I'm safe in time out, I can go in, regulate my emotions, time out ends. 3, it can be an attachment strategy where we say discipline does not need to be a rejection threat. We can enact discipline in a way that makes us solid attachment-wise. And same with trauma. You can see that you can enact time out in a way that says, me giving you instruction, me correcting your behavior is not something that needs to be traumatic. It's an everyday solid event between parents and children that love each other. And of course, we want it to be a step towards cultural and social laws that we agree on. Thus, the core of parenting interventions is time in, engagement, love, warmth, structure, learning, rewards, time out, predictable, democratic, attachment positive. I'm just going to finish on Song, you might remember the traumatized little boy his parents were told they must not use time out with him. The poor kid was biting himself and everything. We disabused the parents of not being able to use time out discipline with him. We did a differential attention program where we used time out for misbehavior, time in with lots of love for the little boy. We taught them emotion coaching when he was calm, and we did a supportive program for his fears. I will never forget the day when his mother called me crying and said that Song had said to her, "I'm happy now, Mummy." Conclusions. In policy, policies that prohibit the use of timeout are ill-considered, disempowered parents and deny access of children in need of effective evidence-based support. Evidence is overwhelming showing that timeout is a positive perturbation in child mental health. Like claims that vaccinations cause autism, claims that it is harmful require evidence. Practice. There is, however, widespread variations in how timeout is implemented, and some of those are potentially harmful. An important priority for all of us is to disseminate accurate information about how discipline should be done in a way to be positive child development strategy. Thank you very much to my team who contributed to this. Thank you for listening, and please contact me if you would like to go any further with this.